So you remember we talked the other night about Templars. Tonight we're going to talk about Templars in a talk that's entitled Nazis in the Promised Land. So who were these Templars? Well, after the Crimea War in 1850, in the mid-19th century, the Templars started to branch out of the Lutheran Protestant Church in Germany. They saw themselves as a temple, meaning that each one of us has in ourselves the potential to be a temple, to be a holy sanctuary, to be a Holy Spirit. And they obviously saw themselves as the new Israel, meaning that the Jews, the old Israel, they were out of the picture with after the crucifixion of Christ. But somewhat revolutionary, they also thought that by living in the Holy Land, they would bring about the redemption, meaning that they would bring about the coming of the Messiah, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And as I mentioned, these ideas weren't too popular with the Lutheran Church. In fact, in 1858, the Templars were expelled from the Lutheran Church. And in 1861, they set up their own temple society, which was, there were two founders behind that, who were Christoph Hoffmann, who you see here, and George David Harding. They were the two founders. And in 1868, they took their constituents and they made Aliyah. They came to live in Palestine, and they formed the first Templar colony in the German colony of Haifa. And here's a picture of what it looked like. Okay, so I mentioned Haifa, that's 1868. They were quickly followed by other colonies, Jaffa in 1869, Sarona in 1871, Jerusalem in 1873. Hoffmann and Harding, as so often happens, they fell out between them, and they had different ideas of what a Templar colony should look like. In 1884, there were about 1,300 Templars in Palestine. 1884 is just after the first Aliyah, so there weren't thousands and thousands of them. They were a minority, but if we look at the Jewish minority in Palestine, the Jewish minority was maybe 20, 30, 40,000 maybe. So in terms of the number of Jews, it was significant. In 1898, Kaiser Wilhelm II, the Kaiser of Germany, visited. He famously met with Herzl. He famously went in through Jaffa Gate, but he also came, perhaps less well known, he also came to Haifa. There's a monument on the Tayelet over the Bay of Haifa, marking that fact. And the reason that he came to Haifa was to meet with the German Templars in the German colony. And shortly after his visit, new colonies went up in Wilhelma, which, if you don't know where that is, if you go on Route 40, the back way to the airport, you come across, there's large areas there which are closed military areas and are used by the Israel aircraft industry. And there you can find the Yishuv of Wilhelma. There's two other Yishuvim which are in the Galil. They are near Tzomit Tishbi, not far from Yokneam, and these are Waldheim, which was founded in 1908, and Bethlehem of the Galilee, which was founded in 1906. By 1913, which was the outbreak of the First World War, there were about 2,000 Templars in Palestine. So what happened during the war? Before that, let's talk about the Templar settlements. So the one top left here is also a picture of Haifa. And the Templars, they had beautiful houses. To this day, you can see them in the German colony, in Haifa, in Emek Rephaim, of course, in Yerushalayim, and in several other places as well, Sarona, Jaffa. And they had these gorgeous stone houses with the red roofs and the green trisim. On the top right here, you can see this is the Templars gathered at the opening of the school in Sarona. By the way, most of the settlements didn't have a church. Waldheim does have a church. The others don't have churches, and that's because the Templars didn't believe in spending Sunday praying in church. They believed that they needed to be out there working the holy soil, and this would bring the redemption. But they were very religious, and here you can see it's still visible on a Templar house in the German colony, written above the lintel, an inscription from 1877, which reads, "Arise and shine, for your light has come, and glory of the Lord rises upon you," which is a sentence taken from the book of Isaiah. In terms of, they were very, very industrious. They were involved in all kinds of industries. So the top right, you can see, this is a cooperative, the vine culture. So this would be the rules of the society of the vine culture. Of course, they were Germans. They had to have rules and regulations. At the bottom here, you can see a letter from the Bank of the Temple Society Limited. It's a reference letter for one Shaul Levi, who was obviously a Jew. So the Templars had the banks, they were involved in hotels, they had printing presses, newspapers, and famously they were very, very involved in the massive expansion in the orange industry. So there were Jews, there were Arabs that were working in the Jaffa oranges, but very much the power behind the business was the Templars, certainly in the early day. And here you can see a stamp that went onto the crates of oranges, Sarona, Wilhelma, which were two of the Templar settlements. So I should mention, if we talk about relations between Jews and the Templars, they were both two minorities having to deal with fairly oppressive Ottoman administration, and obviously majority Arab residents. And there was a lot of collaboration between the Templars and the Jews, particularly in the period of the second Aliyah, that is the Jews that came from 1904 up to the outbreak of the First World War. Tremendous amount of collaboration in all kinds of different industries. Well, World War I would change that somewhat. So Templars volunteered for the German army and fought and died in the First World War. In Emek Raphaim, there is a cemetery with, don't remember how many, I think it may be about 40 graves of Templars that died during the war. And in 1918, as I mentioned in one of the previous talks, General Allenby invaded Palestine, managed to throw out the Ottomans, and he famously came into Jerusalem in just before Christmas in 1917, and 850 Templars were regarded as were expelled and were imprisoned in this tent camp that you see in Egypt. By the way, the only Templar colony that wasn't, so Allenby actually entered the German colony in Haifa, but by then the war was actually over. So under the British mandate, so following the First World War, Jews became increasingly self-sufficient. More Jews came, the Jewish agency, we saw development of Banca Poalim, Solel Bonet, and all kinds of other industries. So Jews became more self-sufficient. And obviously, in the times when the British were there, if we're talking about large infrastructure projects, it became most important for the Jews to collaborate with the British authorities. So relations between Jews and Templars, they tolerated each other, but there was perhaps less collaboration during this period. In 1978, whilst installing a TV aerial in a house in Emek Raphaim, one of those beautiful pre-Templar houses, and it was owned by an 82-year-old Holocaust survivor, and in the attic, there was unearthed a rather disturbing number of, they weren't really artifacts, they were possessions of a previous owner of the house, a Nazi hat, an officer's patch, insignia with swastika, and a steel knife inscribed with blood and honor in German. And as I mentioned, this wasn't somebody who was a collector. It was actually belonged to the previous owner of the house. And this attests to the fact that in 1933, everything changed. Hitler came to power, and his influence was felt not just by Germans that were living in Germany, but by Germans that were living all over the world, and the Templars were very much German. So the founder of the Nazi organization in Palestine in 1933 was an architect, Karl Ruff from Haifa. Nazi party branches were established in Haifa, Jaffa, and Jerusalem, and several other Templar colonies. Ludwig Buchholter, a teacher in the Templar school in the German colony in Jerusalem, he was appointed head of the branch in Jerusalem, and he received instructions from Berlin and worked in coordination with the German consulate. In April 1934, Buchholter hosted a party for local residents at the party headquarters in Jerusalem to celebrate Hitler's birthday. The event began with a performance by the boys' choir from the Schneller orphanage, and after that, Buchholter called for everyone to honor the 45-year-old Führer with a triple Sieg Heil salute. On the 1st of May 1934, the consulate hosted a festive reception, and it was decided that the members were now obliged to greet one another with a Heil Hitler greeting and a straight-armed salute on the street. Until 1934, a British branch of the Scouts operated in the German colony and held various activities for boys and girls separately. The youth went on hikes, erected tent camps in the Wilhelma Templar colony. They learnt Morse code, knot tying, first aid, and sang British songs. In 1934, the club was converted to a branch of the Nazi youth movement, the Hitler Jugend. And I just want to show you a few pictures from a website which is owned by Etty Becker, who I don't know, and Aria Becker. I'll send you the link if you want afterwards, but I'll show you a few. Here you see swastikas, and at the top you can see a banner which says Hitler Jugend Waldheim. You can see boys here dressed in the uniform of the Hitler Youth. You'll see it more clearly in some of the coming pictures. Here you see the boys marching of the Hitler Youth. This is not in Germany, this is in Palestine. Okay, here you can see again a march, two men, I don't know who they are, on the side of the road, giving a Sieg Heil. And again, boys and girls in uniform. And here you see pictures of boys and girls of the Hitler Youth. Again, all in Palestine. Chaviv Hanan was an officer in the Mandate Police. Obviously, he was a Jew, and he describes National Socialist street scene in the second half of the 1930s. Visible through the open windows of the mostly one-story houses was the odd but distinguished furniture, and the walls were adorned with pictures of leaders of the Reich. On the sides of the balconies, under the roof, swastika flags lay folded. He also describes how he would also be greeted by members of the Templar who would Sieg Heil him. During the Arab revolt against the British, which began in April 1936 with a general strike that lasted 6 months, some Arabs saw the Templars as prospective allies in their struggle and hoped that Nazi Germany would conquer Palestine from the British. October 1937, the school in Emek Raphaim was merged with the German evangelical community. The principal of the school was dismissed, and the German Ministry of Information and Propaganda encouraged Palestinian students to attend the German school in order to create a cadre of pro-German leadership that would govern an independent Palestinian state in the future. We know what the Mufti did during the war. He met with Hitler, and he went also to Bosnia to encourage Bosnian Muslims to join up to the Waffen-SS, not the Wehrmacht. Let's go back to the 1930s. About a year later, Gottlieb Borrella, who was a Templar, He rented out his cinema to Eitan Belkin, a Jew, who continued to operate it after changing its name to Efrat. Borla got himself in trouble with his Nazi neighbors too. In January 1936, he received a threatening letter from Buchholter. The local leadership of the National Socialist Party was astounded to learn of the rental of your cinema to Jews. In this context, we direct your attention to the fact that the sale of German property within German colonies currently requires permission from the party's foreign organization, and this applies in any case concerning a sale to non-Aryans with German citizenship. Buchholter noted he was sending copies of his letter to the party leader in Germany and to the party's foreign organization. In this regard, you should take note of potential consequences of your moves for you and your family. So, not all the Templars were Nazis. How many were Nazis? I don't really know how to answer that. Most people would look at how many were actually members of the Nazi party. I saw various estimates ranging from 17% to 30%. Some of them, obviously, like Buchholter, were fanatical Nazis, and some of the Templars, despite risk to themselves and to their families. Remember, Rommel was knocking on the door in 4 or 5 years after this, and there were Templars as well who didn't forget their Jewish business partners and continued to do business with Jews right up to the start of the Second World War. So what happened to the Templars during World War II? Well, in August 1939, 249 men who were of conscriptable age, they got their conscription papers and they left for Germany and they would join the Wehrmacht. And in September of 1939, when war broke out, the British sealed off 4 Templar settlements: Sarona, Wilhelma and Bethlehem and Waldheim, so the one that's in Lod, the 2 that are in the Galil and Sarona, and they sealed them off and used them in internment camps for all Templars, for all people holding German citizenship, except for males of military age who were imprisoned in Akko. And in 1941, 600 of the younger Templar families were deported to Australia, where they were held in basically an imprisonment camp in Tatura, which is 2 hours drive from Melbourne. By the way, the British had the same problem in Britain as well. There were 70,000 Germans in Britain at the outbreak of the war. At the start, they tried to distinguish between those that were spies and those that weren't. But after Dunkirk, where Britain felt that it was isolated and was about to be invaded by the German army from France, all the 70,000 were regarded as enemy aliens, and they were either imprisoned or they had restrictions on movement. My grandfather, for one, was imprisoned in the Isle of Wight, and many of the Germans were also put on a ship for 57 days and were deported to the same camp in Australia. During the war, interestingly, there were 3 deportations of Templars. About 1,000 Templars left Palestine in exchange for 500 Jews. The numbers look very odd, but remember, this is the British were ruling the shop in those days, and they were very anxious to get rid of any German citizens because they were afraid they may be spies, and they were not too concerned with bringing Jews to Palestine. In fact, they didn't want Jews to come in at all. At the end of the war, there were a few hundred Templars remaining in Palestine, and in 1945, Moshe Sharet, who would become Israel's first foreign minister, he demanded from the British immediate deportation of the Templars. Well, the British didn't do that. The Jewish agency somewhat took matters into its own hands, and in 1946, Gottlieb Wagner, who was the head of the Sarona Templar community, he was assassinated in broad daylight while driving in his car in Tel Aviv. He was assassinated by the Palmach, and in 1948, the Haganah would also kill two Templars in the Waldheim colony. April 1948, 1 month before the British leave, they decide to evacuate. They're very worried about what's going to happen to these Templars once they leave, so they decide to evacuate all the remaining Templars to Cyprus. The only Templars that remained were 20 to 30 very elderly people who were sheltered by a nunnery in Jerusalem. And in 1950, these Templars as well were given their marching orders by the Israeli government. And here in the picture, you can see the last Templars that left the state of Israel. What happened to them? Well, what happened to the Templars that went to Australia? Well, the Templars that went to Australia, obviously after the war, they were released from imprisonment, and they founded in 1950 in Melbourne, they founded the Temple Society of Australia. And you can Google them up, and on their website, you can read that founded over 150 years ago in Germany, we are an independent, progressive Christian organization with two central beliefs: to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself, identical to the beliefs of the original Templars from Germany. They quote on their website two very famous sentences from Corinthians and from Peter, which mentions that we all have God's spirits in us, God's temple is within us, and building a spiritual temple. We believe that each person is a temple where God's spirit lives, and most importantly, people acting together build the foundation of God's temple in the world. How many of the members of the Temple Society are descended from original Templars? I cannot tell you, I don't know. What happened here in Palestine / Israel? So in January 1946, there was an Allied committee which decided that all German property, including property outside Germany, will serve as reparations, basically for property that was taken from people by the Germans during the war. And in 1947, the British High Commissioner seized all Templar property in Palestine. In January of 1948, so the British are already on their way out, the city of Tel Aviv purchased 4,234 dunams of Templar property that was Sarona from the British. A very good purchase it was. I don't exactly remember how much they paid, but it was certainly a very good real estate deal. And in 1948, the name was changed to the Kiryah, and this would become headquarters of the Haganah and the Palmach during the War of Independence. It would become the center of the IDF, as it is until this day, of also the intelligence services. And there were many government offices that were originally housed there. You can still see, I think, Chaim Weizmann's original office, which is in Sarona. In 1962, the Israeli government paid 54 million Deutschmarks by way of compensation for Templar property that was now owned by the government. And the aforementioned Buchholzer, who was head of the Nazi party in Emek Rephaim in Jerusalem, he received $60,000. The Israeli government didn't really pay it. It was just credited from the amount of reparations that were paid by the West German government to the Israeli government as part of the reparations settlement. In the 1970s, the whole of the Sarona area is dilapidated, it's falling apart, and ideas start, it's prime real estate, obviously in the center of Tel Aviv, and property developers want to build high-rises. In this case, they're stymied by the fact that a preservation order was placed on the Templar buildings, and nothing went anywhere in the 80s, 90s. Don't quote me on the exact year, but I think it was maybe around 2010 where finally the building was done at Sarona, and there was a compromise done between the preservation and building new buildings. So the high-rises were built, the Sarona shopping mall was built, the whiskey restaurant was built within a original Templar, or I'm not sure if that's an original building, but 18 original Templar buildings were preserved. They were actually, fascinatingly, I think 5 of them were moved. You can see a hydraulic crane behind one of the Templar buildings. They were put on hydraulic jacks, and they were moved to allow Rehov Kaplan to be widened and for an underground car park to be built underneath it. And the next time you're in Sarona, as well as shopping or visiting the Whiskey Museum, by the way, the Whiskey Museum also is connected to a secret tunnel that's there, which is connected to the Templars. But the next time you're there, there is an excellent museum that you can visit, which describes the history of the Templars. And that's it for tonight. And I will unmute you for